name is Tracy Sinclair. Welcome to Coaching in Conversation. Coaching in Conversation is a chance to discuss and explore not just how we can keep developing and maturing as coach practitioners, but also to consider how coaching is evolving and its future potential and place as a powerful vehicle for human development in today's and tomorrow's world. I'll be sharing some of my own thoughts on these topics, and we will also hear from some great guests from around the world who bring their unique experience and perspectives. Hello and welcome to another episode of Coaching in Conversation with myself, Tracy Sinclair, and this time I am joined by Janet Wilson. Janet is a professional certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, and she has over 2,800 client hours working with leaders and executives and individuals and teams across the world, actually, but she has a lot of experience as well, particularly in the Middle East and in Africa. Janet is also a relational team coach as well as a coaching supervisor. She has also spent a considerable amount of time volunteering for the ICF, and she was the president of the UK chapter of the ICF in 2004. And then working at a more global level, she has also been the vice chair of the ICF's Global Dispute Resolution Panel. My conversation with Janet was particularly focused on a very specific topic. And this topic naturally emerged in a conversation that I was having with her recently. And we thought immediately this could be good for an episode of the podcast. So I'm sharing that with you now, and would be really interested to hear your thoughts, your perspectives, your feedback, to engage in a conversation about this. I won't say any more about the topic other than to tell you the title, which is Resilience or Repression. I hope you enjoy. Well, Janet, thank you so much for joining me on this conversation today. It's lovely to carry on a conversation that we've actually already started, and maybe to connect whoever is listening to this with our conversation. We started to speak about resilience.
Yes.
And resilience as being something that is probably very needed at the moment, particularly in many aspects of day-to-day life. But is also a term that is almost used as a throwaway term, and I'm conscious that's my sense of it, that we're just talking about the need for resilience and being resilient. And yet, in actual fact, what I notice in others, and sometimes admittedly in myself, is this question of, am I really being resilient or am I repressing? And it evoked a really interesting dialogue between us, didn't it? Around, are we developing resilience as human beings, truly? Or are we simply repressing, denying, ignoring, burying our feelings? And there's a very important difference, isn't there? So that kind of, I think, contextualizes our discussions, doesn't it? And I'd love to hear your initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID has been one of the things that has raised it to my mind and to my awareness. I've been aware of it for ages, but really been aware of it through COVID, and the changes that we've all gone through COVID. And of course, now in my work, I'm coming across more and more people who are, I think, able to make different choices, Tracy. And I know that that's a strange thing to say, but COVID having had such an incredible impact on us all, and most of us, our working life and how we viewed ourselves and framed ourselves, we're now in a position to go, okay, well, what else is there, or what else could there be? And yet it's not easy. And I don't know whether you feel this, but COVID in some ways has made things that we took for granted a little bit more difficult. So we're having to find that muscle to accept it. And your point about, do I accept it and just swallow it and carry on, which in some instances I must admit I'm doing, or am I truly being able to bounce back? And I'm doing the inverted commas because, this idea that resilience is bounce back ability, and that's it's a non-English word, but you know what I mean. Are we bouncing back, or are we just either disassociating from the impact of it, or, as you say, pushing it down quite hard and gritting our teeth and getting on with it?
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you use that term bounce back, I'm reminded of a great book, actually, for anyone that wants to read about resilience, by Dr. Carol Pemberton, called Resilience, and it's very much targeted at the coaching community. And she actually says that true resilience is not the ability to bounce back, but the ability to bounce forward.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting distinction, isn't it? Because in today's world, in many, many cases, there is no going back, is there, to exactly the way things were before. Certain aspects of life, just homeworking, just to quote a very quick, simple example, things don't always go back to exactly the same shape and size and setting and context that they were before. And so that resilience perhaps also has something, as you were highlighting there, about acceptance of the change, of the loss, or of what's different, and then somehow an ability to not necessarily therefore want to hold on to that and go back to what was, but the capacity to then be creative and go forward to what's coming next.
I love that. And I'm going to just offer something that was raised by what you shared there. I was in South Africa when COVID hit and we locked down. And in fact, I got onto the last Virgin flight from Johannesburg to London. And my husband had broken lockdown to come and fetch me because there was no way of me getting from London to Chester. So, it was one of those sort of really strange situations, and driving up the highway with almost no traffic. It was almost as if I'd gone to a different universe. But I recall very soon thereafter having, I can only describe it as a panic attack, and thinking to myself, A, I'm never going to get back to South Africa and see my family there. And B, I'm never going to work again, because up until that point, I'd been seeing all my clients face to face. And all of a sudden I couldn't. And I can remember standing at my window going, so what does this mean? And really having a physical reaction to that. And having no option but to acknowledge that I was terrified. I was really, really frightened. And it took me a while just to catch my breath again, calm myself down. But I wasn't able to then go, oh, well, it's going to be okay, because I didn't know it was going to be okay. But I was able to acknowledge how frightened I was. And I think that helped me to then go, okay, well, if I end up having to go and work at the local supermarket, that's okay. And I kind of started opening up opportunities where I would be able to get on with life. And I think this is something that I've realized, that resilience is about moving forward. It is about looking at opportunities, because there's something about when hardship hits us, it evokes that shock. I mean, mine was a physiological shock. And if we ignore it, that shock just goes down into repressed energy, and actually is quite hard to be able to use as a resource to move forward.
Yeah.
It makes sense to you.
Well, yes, it does. And, as you're talking, Janet, I'm thinking about how important some kind of acceptance or compassion or empathy is a really important part of the resilience building process. Because when you talked about that panic and that fear, I'm mindful of how many coaching conversations I recall having in the last 2 to 3 years with leaders. And I know from some of the supervision groups that I run, other coaches are having the same, where the leaders that they've been coaching through that pandemic were fearful, were panicking, because they didn't know any better than anybody else what to do. And yet they're being looked to lead. And so, as we know, the pandemic challenged all sorts of definitions and paradigms of what leadership is and what a leader is supposed to bring. And I can remember many conversations with leaders saying, I feel just as frightened as everybody else. And yet I'm supposed to be the person in charge. I'm supposed to be the leader. And so even though we have a situation in organizations perhaps where certain people are supposed to be the resilient ones, they're supposed to be the strong ones, if they don't actually recognize and accept some of their own panic or fear, it's then very hard to actually be resourceful again, isn't it? To actually find what could be the solution moving forwards.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm echoing everything you say because I've had the same experience with leaders. And I think there is something about acknowledgement. It's acknowledging that you're acknowledging our humanity, that we don't have all the answers, but there is something quite powerful about being able to acknowledge openly your feelings. And Brené Brown comes to mind, doesn't she? Here is how was it to be able to say to people, I'm really frightened as well. I don't know what to do. Let's look at what our options are. Let's see how we now carry on doing what it is we were going to do in the world, but in a different way. And what is the impact of acknowledging that, not only to yourself, but to others, on that relationship, and then on our capacity to bounce forward, our capacity to look at ways of reframing and repositioning ourselves for what we're in. And COVID was like that, but we're still there. Well, no, we're not still there. We're in a different place now. We're in a post-COVID place. I guess what's coming into my mind as I'm saying this to you is what stops us from acknowledging, firstly to ourselves, but then to others, what needs to be acknowledged so that we can move forward. What do you think that might be?
Well, I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Because I do think something is stopping it in my own sort of anecdotal experience, because we're still seeing, or I'm still noticing quite systemically across many organizations, a really high incidence of burnout, a lot of very strained cultural patterns within organizations, a lot more people that are becoming unwell with almost, let's call them mysterious conditions, whether there is post-COVID or the long COVID kind of condition, but also people who are just experiencing chronic fatigue, burnout, all of those kinds of things. That even though the theory tells us that it is important to talk about these things, I do still get a sense that repression is what we're defaulting to. I think there's even a trend noticeable within our coaching community, that even coaches are becoming burnt out in some cases, which of course, not that I like to think of coaching as a helping profession as such, because I don't see our roles as helpers, as more like enablers or facilitators of someone else's growth. But coaching could be clustered within that domain, couldn't it, of the helping professions. And one of the things we know is there's often a high incidence of burnout in the helping professions, because people are giving of their energy to others without necessarily taking care of their own. And I know that I can be guilty of that too. I know that I have, for anyone who's familiar with things like the TA drivers and working styles. I have a very strong be perfect driver. I also have quite a strong be strong driver. You know, so we've got these cultural patterns, haven't we, across the world that says we must be strong. And it's almost as though to be strong doesn't then allow for those moments of what we might call weakness. But actually, is that weakness, or is that more meeting the pain, meeting the loss, meeting the fear, meeting the panic, so that we can then work through it rather than just repress it, pretend it's not there, ignore it, deny it, whatever.
I'm smiling a lot because, of course, I'm relating very strongly to everything you say. It's resonating. So, yeah, and that thing about the be perfect and actually sort of moving away from the fear, the fury, the anger, whatever the emotion is that's being pushed up in us. I think we miss an opportunity. I really do think we miss an opportunity, because I think if we can acknowledge that I'm frightened, I'm terrified, and I still see myself standing at the window thinking I'm never going to work again with that terror. If I can acknowledge the terror, and I can even spend a bit of time trying to understand what's beneath the terror, what is the positive intent beneath that terror, then I have the opportunity to go, okay, so if that's what's really making me frightened, if that's what really matters to me, what are the options? And I guess one of mine, just to go back to that incident, was, well, I love people. I want to be able to work with people. And coming to one of the very simplistic solutions, which was, okay, I'll just go and get a job at the local supermarket, because that would still engage me with people. But there's something about, we don't often take that time to say, I'm really frightened, or I'm really feeling lost, or I'm really feeling sad. What's underneath that? What matters to me that emotion is now so strong in me? What we tend to do is go, no, can't be. I haven't got time for that right now. I haven't got time for the anger. I haven't got time for that. I've got to get on. And I think that's where we possibly can slip into the repression. And just to say one other thing about that, the energy that we use to repress is actually quite a lot. And if we could just release that energy around opportunity, gosh, imagine what we could do.
Yeah. I'm really thinking as we're talking that this barrier, this $1 million question of what stops us, is something around our inability or our not wanting to engage with the difficult emotions, perhaps, because it reminds me of something I read in a book that I reread. I'm rereading some old classics at the moment. So I was reading Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway.
Yeah.
And also The Untethered Soul. And there was something in The Untethered Soul that was really quite striking, that was about, and it was talking about, more elevated states of consciousness and joy and bliss and all of those wonderful things. And one of the things that became very clear in that is that ultimately, in order to achieve those higher states of consciousness and those more, states of joy, we have to go through the pain of the human emotions that we can't ignore them, because all the while we ignore them, we keep ourselves closed to what's possible emotionally. And so I do think there's something there about, whether it's, that feel the fear and do it anyway kind of analogy, and actually somehow, whether with whatever support or environment or circumstances we need, to meet the pain, to meet the fear, to meet the loss, whatever is the panic, as you were describing, whatever is the horrible emotion that we really, really don't want to feel, to actually meet it and have that that level of recognition, that level of acceptance and compassion, so that then we can move through it rather than try to work around it, as it were.
And it's so interesting. So feel the fear and do it anyway. I wonder if we were to put that on a set of scales, what you're talking about is we need to do the feel the fear. I think often when we talk about resilience, we're talking about do it anyway. And it's a really interesting one. And I couldn't agree with you more. There's something about acknowledging that, and also acknowledging and I don't want to, it's not the lesson, but the message that those feelings, those memories, those thoughts have for us. And they have a message, and being able to acknowledge the message, but it's about really getting in touch with that. Yeah, I'm very struck by this balance, and struck by the balance even in our conversation, which is resilience and repression, and struck too by our journey as human beings. So we have this really interesting, we have choices that we make throughout life, which are a balancing act. Here we go back to the scales, between expectations of ourselves and others of us. And the other end is that real desire for self-actualization, to be the very best version of ourselves and to be able to contribute to the world. And somehow we're doing that balancing act all the time. And I think when we don't, if we can just acknowledge that resilience can often be a should, which comes from expectations of others. And if we could check in with ourselves and go, okay, so am I dealing with this because I should be strong or I should be perfect, our drivers, or am I doing this because actually, if I can get beyond this, I will be able to be a better version of myself, or more self-actualized. So that I think it opens this subject to a whole different energy, doesn't it? I don't think it's a subject that we can just go, well, it's one or the other. I think it's a combination of both. And if we can engage with it so that we are aware, I am actually having to deal with this memory, thought, feeling in a way that isn't helping me right now, that's fine. Because that's your choice, and we can do that, and sometimes we have to.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I was noticing what was coming up in my mind was all of the excuses that can come up, and I know they can come up in my own, around why I shouldn't engage with a difficult feeling, and we've spoken about, haven't we, around this idea of a fear that if I engage with my difficult feelings, if I engage with my sense of loss, fear, panic, whatever it is, I might not be able to put myself back together again. It feels like some vast, I think you described it as a big black hole, didn't you, opening up in front of you. It feels so all-consuming that we almost feel like we can't come back from that we won't be able to feel better again, or feel or tap into our strength again, which of course we know intellectually is not the case. But when those difficult feelings can come over us, they can be very seductive, can't they, in terms of being, almost the fear of them being a permanent state.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that I also was coming into my mind was another fear of being judged.
Yes.
Of we're already dealing with something that's difficult, and then layered onto that we have this fear that I won't be able to put myself back together again. But then the fear of what will people think of me because I'm feeling vulnerable? And even though we know all of these things are important, it's still so much easier said than done, isn't it, to really role model this.
Yeah, you talk about other people judging us, and of course that's a huge fear, and that is part of the expectation. But often I think certainly for me, I'm my own biggest critic. I'm my own worst judge. So there is something about that voice inside of me which goes, Janet, pull yourself together, or Janet, get over it. And I think there's that judgment of self that I need to acknowledge as well, and recognize that stops me sometimes engaging more usefully. And Tracy, I don't think there's a right and wrong here. I really don't think there's a right and wrong. I think there's something about being open to just noticing when we're having to make a choice between resilience and repression. And noticing why we're doing that, noticing what's important, what matters. And for me, that's the thing that's so wonderful about the work we do, because we're having conversations with people about things that matter to them. And then personally, if we can do it around this, I think it would be a much more useful way of managing the difficult the difficult times, the difficult emotions, the difficult memories.
And you've shared a little bit, haven't you, about yourself, that you're not perfect either. You can repress and deny and all of those things, just like I can. What have you learned about yourself in that, and how you can therefore tap into truer resilience rather than repression, that maybe anyone listening to this could think, well, that might be insightful for them? What is your own wisdom around this?
Or you over egg it. There's no wisdom here. This is a learning process. It really is a learning process. I've recently been diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder, and it's something I live with all the time. But I think there is something about, it's a lesson that's coming back to me, because what I'm finding is I have a strong driver to get things done. So I tend to just push. And I've recently moved home. So I'm going to give a very practical example. Recently moved home, have a low tolerance of chaos. So I really want to get things sorted. And I will spend hours and hours physically putting things in place, sorting out, organizing, and I've done it for 10 days. And then all of a sudden my body just goes, no, sorry, this is not happening. And I get an infection, or I get something that just says, right, that's it. You can't get out of bed right now. You're going to have to just relax. So and just take care of yourself. So when you say wisdom, I'm nowhere near there. But what I have got now is maybe it's an excuse, Tracy. Maybe this is what I'm saying, is my body is giving me an excuse to have to think about my energy, how I use it, when I use it, and when I have to stop and build it again. So I don't keep giving from, feeling as if there's an endless supply. There isn't an endless supply anymore, and that's the reality. So that's from a physical point of view. But oh my goodness, the emotional side of it as well. There is something about, I can't anymore. I need to now stop, regroup, find a way of replenishing so that I can continue. So yeah, no wisdom here, just a personal experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm there with you too. We're a work in progress, aren't we? And one of the things I've learned about myself, probably in the last couple of years, is I realize I've been blessed with a very healthy body, if you like. I'm very, very lucky that I don't, touch wood, tend to get ill. I've never broken any bones. I've never had any major illnesses. I've been really, really fortunate. I also am fortunate in that I'm fit and strong and healthy, and I'm quite active. I have quite high levels of energy. And the thing I've learned about that is I've learned that has at times led me, even though I'm almost hesitating and embarrassed to say this, is I can sort of think I'm invincible.
Yeah.
you know, like I wouldn't say that necessarily to other people, and I've probably said it to lots of people
You
now.
said a lot to me.
hopefully lots of people, if they're listening to this, is I can get myself into that mindset of, well, I can do with anything, and therefore take for granted what I have been gifted with, because I will run it into the ground. You know, I have the capacity to work very long hours. I have the capacity to spin many plates. And because I've always been able to do that, and between you and I like the buzz of that. You know, there's a level of adrenaline and a level of excitement and vibrancy that I enjoy from the variety and the buzz and the various projects that I'm working on, that can delude me into thinking, well, I'm fine. I don't really need to pay too much more attention to looking after myself. When of course, you know, how stupid is that? How ignorant and how naive could I be? And it's only as I now start to get older that the body is knocking on the door. You know, the body starts to knock on the door, doesn't it? And say, well, actually, you know, I do need a little bit more sleep, or I do want some rest. I do want to do more exercise. And, you know, maybe I'm describing myself as someone that's, you know, got a terrible diet and doesn't do any exercise at all. I have a very healthy lifestyle in that regard, in terms of food and drink and exercise and all of those things. But within all of that, there is still this arrogant voice that I can engage with that says, don't worry, you know. And it's as I've got older, and I suppose it's almost that window of time where I start to think, well, can I really run my system, myself, like this indefinitely? And the body says, no, probably not, Tracy. And so it's just a little, you know, that little niggling that comes into my ear. You know, I thankfully for myself, obviously, haven't had the wake up call, if you like, that you experienced with your recent diagnosis, which of course is a way of, you know, pulling you off by the collar, isn't it, and saying, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
But I'm noticing that if I was to not change the way I operate, that wake up call is waiting there, isn't it?
Yeah. And maybe not. Maybe you are just one of those lucky people who physically you can. I mean, I so relate to you because I love spinning plates. There's nothing that gives me more buzz than that kind of thing. And it may not be a physical thing, but there is something about would taking care of yourself just a little bit more give you more energy, and how would that be? I don't know, and I would never. I mean, I just hope you don't ever, and I'm okay, I'm all right. I hope your body does carry on, and I took it for granted. I took my body for granted. And yes, I do like that little bit of a tug, but I see it as having a positive intent. And as I get on older, I just have to learn to look after myself. I just perhaps needed to take that lesson a little earlier, and I might not have got here.
Yeah, it's hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? It's a wonderful thing. I'm conscious that we could keep talking about this topic for a long time, and we're probably coming close to the end of our time for now. What would you like to say about this topic, Janet, in summary, as we bring this conversation to a pause? We might have others, of course, I hope we do. But how might you conclude our conversation so far today?
It's really has me thinking, which is one of the things that I love about the work we do. I just love the new perspectives and thoughts, and they bounce between us, don't they? But I think from the resilience versus repression point of view, I think one of the things that's coming up very strongly in me is awakening self-awareness around it, and recognizing that we are faced with difficulties. We are faced with things that don't lie well with us, or, whatever, they have an impact on us. And if we can intentionally engage with them differently, I think we might end up freeing our energy in a more useful way. So I'm talking as if that's for everybody, but that's what I'm thinking for me.
Yeah. And for me, I'm feeling a real desire to challenge some of these, maybe these binary definitions of things, like, and I'm not saying this is the case for other people, but I know that in the past I can see resilience equals strength,
yes,
weakness equals bad, those binary kinds of ways that we engage with this. And yet, is resilience just about being strong? And is strong in complete, does being strong eradicate any form of vulnerability? Let's not call it weakness even, but any form of vulnerability. So, maybe we've just enormously underpinned Brené Brown's work here today, as I come to my own conclusion. But for me, the key piece is, let's not mistake resilience for just putting on a brave face. Let's not think that resilience is me just having that typical stiff upper lip, or being able to just pull myself together and keep going, because that is not what it means, is it? And that's not sustainable. That somewhere within true resilience is a place where we do meet the darker side of some of those emotions, and we work through them so that we really can bounce forward.
Absolutely. Lovely.
Well, thank you so much, Janet. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and who knows, maybe we'll pick up on this another time.
It sounds like it's a much bigger subject than we've been able to deal with this time.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you.
You have been listening to Coaching in Conversation by Tracy Sinclair, a podcast aimed at exploring how coaching is a vehicle for human development in today's and tomorrow's world. You can learn more about coach training and development at tracysinclair.com and follow us on social media. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and review, and also share it with your networks to help us expand our reach. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.